And so you can be seated the time if you want, or you can come up. Okay, whichever you prefer.
Yeah. Hey.
Welcome to Florida.
Yeah, thank you. How are you?
35 years.
I know. Wow.
Still in the business.
Good for you. Not much of a business left.
We're still there. I've been at the post 28 years.
Have you? Wow. Wow, that's great.
I've never been in the Chapman.
Everybody's going through layoffs, including the Inquirer. The Inquirer.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Welcome to the 32nd anniversary of the Miami Book Fair. My name is Carol Tulikangis, and I'm a volunteer host, and we're delighted to have you join us this morning. There are many sessions running today, and there are activities in the Children's Alley and programs in the Swamp and Porch, and there's a whole lot going on, so I'm glad you're starting your morning with us. The other thing is that we'd like to ask you to consider becoming a member of the Friends of the Book Fair. And we have some friends here, I'm sure, and we'd like to thank anyone here who is a member of the Friends of the Book Fair. Your contribution to the book fair allows this event to happen every year. This year, supporting the fair is easier than ever. You can text book to 501-501 to donate $10, and you'll receive a text back to confirm your donation. We also want to thank the sponsors, the Knight Foundation, OHL Arellano, and the Batchelor Foundation, and many more. The book fair doesn't end today. There are activities that go on and events that happen throughout the year, and all over here and all over Miami. And I work for the college, but I think everybody needs to be grateful for Miami-Dade College because this is an enormous event, and many, many, many people go into making it happen every year. Yes, thank you. I agree. There will be a brief question and answer period at the end, and there is a microphone sitting in the middle of the aisle. And if you intend to ask a question, please, near the end of the presentation, line up at the microphone. The other thing about that microphone is it's very sensitive, and you do not have to get close to it in order to be heard. You can stand 12 inches away, probably farther away than I am from this, and still be heard. You do not have to get right up to it, and the microphone is stationary, so it stays there. So if you have questions, you can line up. We will be finished with this session at 10 minutes to 11 because there's another session that starts at 11. So this room, we need to get people in and out. So at 11:50, for sure, we will be ending the session. Introducing our guest author this morning will be Dr. Austin.
Hi, good morning. I'm a radiation oncologist by training and trade, I guess, but at heart, at my core, I'm a political junkie, and I love history. So this type of book excites me, I have to admit. Chris Hedges has written an amazing book called Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, spent 20 years or so as a foreign correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans, and for the last 15 years has been writing for the New York Times. In this book, he investigates what social and psychological factors cause revolution, rebellion, and resistance. For people who have his worldview, which I do, it's a great read. For those of us who are really appalled by what frequently appears as collusion between government and corporations, you'll get this book. Those of us in civil society are really up against this power structure, this powerful elite. And he talks about that in great detail in the book. But this book is probably most important for people who have a different worldview, for those living in the Fox News bubble, I think of them. But unfortunately, I think most of them are not reading. They're not here, that's for sure. And many of them are really anti-intellectuals, so they won't read this book. Mr. Hedges, in his book, talks about probable popular uprising all over the world, including in this country. He sees these things as being inevitable in the face of environmental destruction, this obscene and worsening wealth gap. So this catastrophic climate change, infrastructure collapse, grotesque and worsening inequality, he feels are prerequisites for popular uprising, and argues further that our resistance to this is a moral imperative. So it's an amazing read, and it's certainly worth your while. I present to you Chris Hedges.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. This book, the three previous books, in my mind, were a kind of trilogy dissecting what's happened to our country, the corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, as the great writer John Ralston Saul calls it, the rise of a system that our most important contemporary political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, who we lost a few weeks ago, calls inverted totalitarianism. And he defines inverted totalitarianism as different from classical forms of totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state, that you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, our most basic civil liberties, and yet internally have seized the levers of power to render the citizenry impotent. And so Death of the Liberal Class was a look at the collapse of our liberal institutions, those mechanisms that made piecemeal and incremental reform possible, that ameliorated, adjusted the system of corporate capitalism. The great and most dramatic example being the New Deal, with the breakdown of capitalism and the decision by a charter member of the oligarchic elite, Roosevelt, to use the government to create 15 million jobs, public works projects, Social Security. And as Roosevelt said, his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. But without those liberal institutions, that safety valve is shut off. And the destruction of our radical movements, which, as Howard Zinn correctly points out in his book, opened up the space in American democracy. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, none of which achieved power, formal political power. The destruction of those movements, coupled with a disemboweling of the liberal class itself, so that it becomes a shadow entity. Bill Clinton, perhaps best embodying this faux liberalism. So it's under Clinton that you get NAFTA, the greatest portrayal of the working class in this country since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act. It's under Clinton that you get the omnibus crime bill that explodes our prison population, 3 strikes, you're outlaws. It's under Clinton that you get the destruction of welfare. And under our welfare system, our old welfare system, 70% of the recipients were children. It's under Clinton that you get the deregulation of the FCC that allows a handful of corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, to seize the airwaves. And of course, it's under Clinton that you get the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which had put firewalls between investment and commercial banks, precipitating both the national and global financial crisis. Clinton understood very well what he was doing. He continued, as Obama has done, to speak in that kind of feel your pain language of liberalism while assiduously serving corporate power. And by the 90s, the Democratic Party had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and when Obama ran in 2008, he actually got more money than the Republican candidate. That was death of the liberal class, going back to Woodrow Wilson, one of the darkest figures in American political history, not only because he was a racist and a segregationist, which he was, and I was just at the protests, the occupation of the president's office at Princeton with those courageous students, but because of his destruction of radical movements, which had given voice at the late 19th century and early 20th century to working men and women who had been horrifically oppressed and often oppressed violently. We had the bloodiest labor wars of any industrialized nation. Hundreds of American workers were murdered. Tens of thousands were blacklisted. And then I wrote a book called Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle, which, as you correctly alluded to, kind of charters what happens when you live in a society that severs itself from print, that is image-driven. Totalitarian societies, as Hannah Arendt and other writers have pointed out, are image-based, spectacle-driven societies where the population confuses how they are made to feel with knowledge. And I spent 20 years abroad. I've never watched Seinfeld. I know nothing about, it's kind of really quite pathetic how little I know about popular culture. But I opened the book with professional wrestling, reality television. We went and bought, my wife and I helped me with the book, whole series of Survivor and this kind of stuff. Because you can find out the values that are being inculcated into a culture. The scenarios, I mean, I was in Madison Square Garden for one of these wrestling matches, and what struck me, aside from the size of these guys, was how emotional the crowd was. And I think that, on some level, certainly if you had stopped them, they would have understood that it was theater. But on the other, this theater was portraying their reality. And it was a reality of people who've been completely cast aside as human refuse in the age of neoliberalism. So you had a scenario where a former prisoner who had PTSD was fighting his former jailer who had tortured him and abused him. You had a prisoner who had gone bankrupt in the crash of 2008 and was beholden to a venal and corrupt and manipulative manager. Everybody cheats. There is no kind of black and white, good and bad. So as soon as the referee turns their back, cheating is allowed. Reality television, of course, celebrating the worst elements of a capitalist society, a penchant for deception, manipulation, the cult of the self, narcissism, so that you can have fleeting fame and money. And then I did the book Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt with the great cartoonist Joe Sacco. We spent 2 years on it, traveling around. We were in Immokalee, Florida, writing from the poorest pockets of the United States, these so-called sacrifice zones, places that have been sacrificed first. The coal fields of southern West Virginia. We opened the book in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Places where unfettered, unregulated capitalism have no external or internal checks, what that does to the environment, what that does to communities, what that does to families, what that does to politics, what that does to the courts, because we've all now become one vast sacrifice zone. In the age of inverted totalitarianism, it doesn't matter what we want. nor does it matter what our rights are. Our rights have been taken from us, in essence, by judicial fiat. So that's how you get a Supreme Court decision that interprets unlimited corporate campaign contributions as the right to petition the government or free speech. That's how you get a court system that refuses to confront the evisceration of our privacy. All of us having all of our electronic communications not only monitored, but stored in perpetuity in government computers. I covered the Stasi, collapse of the Stasi state in East Germany, which was the most efficient security and surveillance state until our own. And you never want to give government this kind of power. As Arendt and other writers on totalitarianism correctly point out, totalitarian systems collect information on all citizens not to find a crime, but so that at a particular moment when they seek to criminalize an individual or a group, they can interpret whatever activity they have carried out as criminal. And as some of you may know, when Barack Obama signed into law at midnight 2011, Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, I sued the president in federal court. Section 1021 permits the U.S. military, overturning over 150 years of domestic law, to seize U.S. citizens who, quote unquote, substantially support. That's not a legal term. That's not material support. Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, to strip them of due process and hold them indefinitely in military facilities until, in the language of this section, the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is a lifetime. And to our amazement, and certainly the amazement of the Obama White House, we won in the Southern District Court of New York, where a very courageous judge, Catherine B. Forrest, in her opinion of her ruling, wrote that this section opens up the possibility that the government, as I said before, can criminalize an entire group of people and strip them of due process. And she raised the case of the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II. The Obama White House appealed. That didn't surprise us. What surprised us is how aggressive they were. The day of the ruling, they sent lawyers from the NSA, because along with the federal attorneys, and said that in the name of national security, the law had to be put, the temporary injunction had to be removed, and the law had to be put back into effect. Judge Forrest, to her credit, refused. They were in the Second Circuit or appellate court the next morning and made the same request. Unfortunately, the Second Circuit conceded. And the question was why? Why were they so aggressive? And I think the lawyers and I came to the conclusion that it's because they're already using the law. That in black sites in Pakistan or Bagram, there are most likely U.S. Pakistani or U.S. Afghani dual nationals who, if they could get out while that injunction was in place, could hold the government in contempt of court. And what happened next was a kind of window into how the court system has been used to utterly reinterpret our constitutional rights. I had also been a plaintiff in Clapper versus Amnesty International, which challenged the government on wholesale surveillance. It got to the Supreme Court. This was before the Snowden revelations, and in the court, the government attorneys told the Supreme Court that I and the other plaintiffs were making these charges based on speculation, and then they went on to say that if we were being surveilled by the government, we would be told. And the court dismissed the case by saying, and which is what they do, by saying we don't have standing, we don't have a right to bring the case. And the Second Circuit, which had made it months to make a decision, because they don't want to go back and rule on the merits, because this is just patently unconstitutional. Both the seizure or the intrusion into our privacy, the government surveillance that we all endure, along with the use of the military as a policing force. And so the Second Circuit said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama, and they threw it out. But over and over, we are watching the courts. We've seen it in the anti-fracking movement, where communities like Denton, Texas, will organize, ask that the health of their communities, the health of their children be protected, pass fracking bans. This has happened in Colorado, Ohio, Pennsylvania on the local level. And then, in the case of Texas, it was the Texas Senate. In the case of Ohio and Colorado, it's often been the legislature or the courts essentially bans the ban. It tells local communities they have no right to control their own destiny. Over and over, when we did the NDAA, they did a national poll, and they found that Section 1021 of the NDAA had a 97% disapproval rating, and yet it's law. Same with the bailouts. A constituent calls opposing the bailouts across the political spectrum in 2008 to Congress were 100-1 against the bailouts. Passed anyway. And this is very dangerous because it creates a system of political paralysis, the inability on the state that's been seized by an oligarchic corporate cabal to respond rationally to what's happening to the citizenry. And the longer that continues, the inability of the government to respond rationally, the more you give rise to demagogic and very frightening figures, buffoonish figures like Trump out of power, very dangerous figures in power. And I was in Montgomery, Alabama, a while ago with the great civil rights attorney Brian Stevenson, who has spent his life defending prisoners on death row, who not surprisingly are poor and black. And we were walking through Montgomery, and Brian was showing me all the Confederate memorials that have been put up. Half of Montgomery is black. It's where King had his first church. It's where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. And Brian said, you know, most of these memorials, including a gigantic Confederate flag, which flies on the outskirts of Montgomery, were put up in the last 10 years. And they had just actually had a reenactment of Jefferson Davis's inaugural, where a bunch of white guys had dressed up as Confederate soldiers and somebody had dressed up like Jefferson Davis and gotten Montgomery was the first Southern White House, and they'd gone through the center of the city playing Dixie and waving Confederate flags and reenacted the inaugural on the steps of the Capitol. And I said to Brian, that's just like Yugoslavia, because the war in Yugoslavia, which I covered for the New York Times, was driven not by ancient ethnic hatreds, but by the economic collapse of Yugoslavia. And people retreated in that collapse into mythic narratives about themselves. And once you retreat into that mythic narrative about yourself, it becomes impossible to communicate, because you are perpetuating a narrative that's not based on verifiable fact. And you're watching dispossessed poor whites retreat into, especially in the South, this neo-Confederate movement, which celebrates white supremacy as something that protected Christian values and provided moral renewal. And the only way to break the back of that, and I had spent a few years ago, 2 years, writing a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I was trying to reach out to him. Dealing with this non-reality-based belief system driven by despair. You can't have a rational discussion with people who think that the world was created in 6 days And as I saw in the Creationist Museum, a multi-million-dollar structure in Peterborough, Kentucky, you go in and they've recreated the Garden of Eden with a fake waterfall, and the plastic Eve is turned in such a way that you can't see her breasts or anything because they don't have clothes. And there's a T-Rex with a saddle. And the guide is saying, well, I'm sure you all wonder why the T-Rex has such big teeth. That's because the T-Rex was used to open the coconuts. And then we went into the next room with a replica of Noah's Ark, and the guide said, well, I'm sure you all want to know how Noah got the dinosaurs on the ark. Well, Noah only put baby dinosaurs on the ark. And you know, while it's funny in a room like this, when you're in a room with people who believe it, it's terrifying. Because those people cannot be reached through rational discussion. They are driven, all totalitarian systems are forms of magical thinking, and the neo-Confederate movement, the nativist movement, the creationist movement, these are all segments of the society which have been unable to cope in a reality-based world and therefore have shut that reality-based world off. And this is very true in the Middle East. And I spent 7 years in the Middle East, much of that time in Iraq and Gaza, watching the rise of groups like Al-Qaeda, which I covered after 9/11 based in Paris, or ISIS. And it's a very similar phenomenon where the creation of failed states, the misery, the lack of opportunity, the fear, the destruction of families, childhood, communities, basic services, including electricity, the breakdown of civil society, the rise of warlords, the endemic terror, 12 years of bombing, gives rise, vomits up groups like ISIS, or vomits up figures like Radovan Karadzic, or Slobodan Milosevic, or vomits up figures like Trump. And what we're watching, I mean, we have to hand it to the Clintons, who I think are probably some of the most venal, amoral politicians in the country. There is a diabolical brilliance to what Bill Clinton did in that he turned the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and he pushed the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. But we are now reaping the consequences of that, because the frustration that people feel, the entrapment that people feel, the loss of hope, the inability of the government to respond on the most basic level is not fiction. What is fiction is what these proto-fascist movements peddle in terms of an ideology. And they do what all proto-fascist movements do, which is direct that legitimate rage to the vulnerable. Undocumented workers, African Americans, Muslims, homosexuals, intellectuals, feminists, liberals. They have a very long list of people they hate. And what frightens those of us who come out of the Middle East is, I think at this point, the inevitability of another catastrophic terrorist attack on American soil, where with the flick of a switch, the corrosion of our legal system, the rise of militarized police will create a very overt police state, something that's already overt in marginal communities. And again, Hannah Arendt, in Origins of Totalitarianism, writes about this phenomena. She was stripped of her German citizenship, actually spent 3 weeks in the Gestapo, barely escaped with her life, becomes stateless, and experiences on the eve of World War I what undocumented workers and what people of color and marginal communities in our nation experience daily, that sense of where heavily armed police forces are empowered to serve as judge, jury, and executioner, and there is no possibility of justice or redress, both in terms of the way the legal system has been constructed and the physical presence of these, what she calls omnipotent policing forces on the streets. And she said at that moment, a society enters a very dangerous epoch, because at that moment, rights become privileges, privileges that can be taken away. 94, I teach in a prison. I've taught in a prison for many years. I mean, I've also taught at places like Princeton and Columbia. But the reason I stay in a prison is because in every class I teach in a prison, I've got a core of students who could bury any kid at Princeton. No, it's not a joke. And they never had a chance, which is, of course, what happens when you're poor. You're lucky if you get one chance. But if you come out of the elite, and I had the unfortunate experience of being sent to a New England boarding school at the age of 10, one of 16 kids on a scholarship, so grew up with the elites, which is why I hate them so much. You get chance after chance after chance. George W. Bush being the kind of poster child for, you know, an utter failure and a cokehead and somebody who coasted through life on phenomenal entitlement, going AWOL and never having a job till he's 40 and ends up president of the United States. And in that prison system, these people never go to trial. 94% of them plea out. And the ones who get the longest sentences are the ones who actually do go to trial, try and make the system work. And as Michelle Alexander correctly points out, if everybody went to trial, the system would crash. So if you're not going to cut that deal with the prosecutor, who you've got 16 charges, at least half of which you never committed, which the prosecutor knows, and you don't cut that deal, then you're going to go get charged with everything. And my students with the longest sentences are the ones who often didn't commit the crime and went to trial. But 15 minutes with a public defender isn't really going to help you when you got cops up there and it's your word against theirs. And so, as Arendt points out, in a society such as ours, where police can kick down your door at 2 in the morning, terrorize everybody, where you are, through systemized forms of debt peonage, which is what warrants are. So I just met one of my students who got out after 11 years, and all of the traffic tickets and fines that he was unable to pay when he went into prison had just accrued interest and are now thousands of dollars. This is typical. So when that guy was stopped for his taillight, remember, and he got out of the car and fled, he fled because he had warrants he couldn't pay. And if he was arrested or stopped or they ran a check, he'd go right back into prison. And we now have, with the corporatization of prisons, i.e. corporations profiting off of the most vulnerable, Global Tel Link, prisoners and their families pay 4 to 5 times in phone charges what we pay. All the commissaries are privatized. I got a list of commissary prices in '96 and today, and almost everything, and we're talking about toothpaste, soap, you know, that kind of stuff, all raised by over 100%, and yet the pay, which is $28 a month for 40 hours a week of work, is the same. So we're now getting more and more prisoners who are leaving in debt. They don't issue, in New Jersey even, they don't issue shoes. You have to buy them. They're $45 for a pair of Reeboks. And so not only are people being incarcerated unjustly, not only are people being incarcerated with sentences that are unthinkable in most of the rest of the world, but they're leaving prison in debt. And this was one of the driving forces behind Ferguson, because in the age of austerity and neoliberalism, county and city budgets have to make up significant percentages of their revenue, 30, 40% themselves. And they do it through fines. Fines for standing too long on the sidewalk. Fines for, not mowing your lawn, this kind of, which is a fine in Ferguson. And what we've done is reconfigured, allowed corporate power to reconfigure our society into a form of neo-feudalism. 51% of American families make less than $30,000 a year. Officially, the poverty rate is 24,000 and something, but this is a fictitious figure. So half of our country lives in poverty. You count near poverty, we're pushing 2/3 of the country. The reconfiguration of both a national and a global economic system to empower a rapacious oligarchic elite at our expense, and the paralysis of a political system that caters to that elite. There is no way in the American political system to challenge the interests of Goldman Sachs or ExxonMobil or General Dynamics. You can't do it. And my criticism of Bernie Sanders, aside from the fact that he's running as a Democrat, and aside from the fact that he's sold out the Palestinians, which I will never do, is that he doesn't grasp what is a fundamental tenet for those of us who are socialists, and that is that you cannot have a republic and have an imperium. And this goes back to ancient Rome. They're irreconcilable. You cannot have unchecked militarism and have an equitable society. And we are collapsing the way all imperial powers in the past have collapsed, in that we are expanding beyond our capacity to sustain that expansion. We have squandered trillions, some estimates are $1.6 trillion a year, in futile, useless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which we've lost. The Taliban controls more of Afghanistan than it controlled when we went in. Iraq as a unified country is splintered and fragmented, will never be reconstituted, and ISIS now controls an area the size of Texas. And to pay for it, we're being hollowed out from the inside. You drive across this country in city after city, it's just one boarded up wasteland after another. Unemployment figures, which officially are around 5%, are fictitious. As even papers like the LA Times have pointed out, real unemployment is at least 17%, maybe more. And the government's not responding. It's not responding, it's not responding, it's not responding. And the longer that paralysis continues, the more you create a system whereby an impotent, self-identified liberal elite, embodied in figures like Obama, whose assault on civil liberties has actually been worse than that carried out by George W. Bush. And this is what happened in Yugoslavia, it's also what happened in Weimar, is that the longer that paralysis continues and an impotent, self-identified liberal elite is unable to respond, or in fact only responds to a narrow power interest, in this case corporate power, then the more you build a movement that turns not only on those self-identified liberals, but the purported values that they claim to defend. And we are now watching that within the Republican primary. And the only way to break the back of these proto-fascist movements is to reintegrate them into the economy. The only way to break the back of the Christian right is to reintegrate these people into the economy, which is the only way to break the back of extremism in the Middle East, which Rabin understood. I knew Rabin, and I knew King Hussein. And unfortunately, the death of King Hussein and the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin ended any hope for a rational solution to the Palestine-Israel conflict. Because Rabin understood in the Oslo, well, first of all, he understood that the occupation was poisoning and killing his country, and he understood through the Oslo Agreement that if the Palestinians were given an economic state in the state of Israel, they would not be strapping on suicide vests and blowing people up on buses. If people had hope, if Ahmed could work in a garage in Tel Aviv and buy his family a refrigerator and send his children to school and have hope for a future. But when you close all avenues of hope, as the Israelis have done with our complicity in Gaza, when you have young men who cannot leave or enter Gaza, who are stateless, in essence, who have no work, who are sleeping 10 to a floor, and have no hope, then the only avenue you leave open to them for their affirmation is death, martyrdom, to be a shaheed. And I saw it in Gaza. Because if you were a shaheed, Hamas would come and set up the white plastic chairs up and down the dirt alley in your refugee camp and would serve food, and your poster would be put on the walls, and if you had a body, you would have a large funeral procession. And neoliberalism, globalization, which turns vast swaths of our population into human refuse, is creating both domestically and internationally very frightening, nihilistic, violent movements. We've had not only 47, I think, school shootings this year, but we've had 27 or 28 assassinations of law enforcement officials. These are not gun battles. We just had another one the other day. These are all symptomatic of a society that is disintegrating not only economically and politically, but morally. 3.1 usually unarmed citizens in this country are murdered by out-of-control police. And it doesn't matter how often people march in Ferguson or Baltimore or New York, they keep killing. And that's symptomatic of the paralysis, the inability of the system to respond even when law enforcement officials are using indiscriminate, lethal force against unarmed citizens. We have watched on videos our own citizens being choked to death on the streets of New York with Garner for the crime of selling loose cigarettes, which he wasn't even selling at that time. And I'll close before the questions, brings me to this book. And we haven't even spoken about climate change, which says that perhaps the most difficult existential crisis of our time is to accept the reality in front of us and not be overcome by despair. To still resist. That resistance is a moral imperative. I go back to my own training as a seminarian. That, as Father Daniel Berrigan said, we are called to do the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it and then let it go. That the Buddhists call it karma, but that we don't know where it goes. In fact, empirically, everything around us may, as it has, indicate that things are worse, but that does not invalidate what we have done. Sublime madness, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr calls it. Writing that liberalism in moments of extremity is too intellectual, too ineffectual, too little emotional a force to deal with what Kant calls radical evil. Systems of death, because that's what these corporate systems are. They will kill us, literally, if we do not rise up and resist. And we, especially those of us who are older, have a responsibility to those who come after us. Because even if we fail, at least I want my children to say he tried. And that means doing what I saw in Eastern Europe. I was every night in the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel, Klaus, Dinsbier. It means what Havel in his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, calls living in truth. It means going to jail. That's more time than I care to donate to this government, but I do it. Because finally, resistance is carried out not for what you can achieve, but for who it allows you to become. And I spend a lot of time in the book interviewing great resistance fighters, from Julian Assange to Mumia Abu-Jamal. Resistance, as Auden says, is that ironic point of light that flashes out wherever the just exchange their messages. It keeps alive another narrative, a narrative of life. I was in Prague that winter, and all through the streets were posters of a young university student named Jan Palach, who in 1968, to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, had gone to Wenceslas Square and burned himself. He died 4 days later. The funeral procession, which was a non-event on state media, was broken up by the police. When his body became a shrine, his remains were exhumed and cremated and given to his mother, and she was told she could not bury them. And that winter, there were posters up and down the streets of Prague. And 2 weeks after the communist government fell, 10,000 people marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. That is the moral power of resistance. I was in Wenceslas Square when the great singer Marta Kubasheva walked out on the balcony in front of 500,000 Czechs. In 1968, she had sung the prayer for Marta, the anthem of defiance against the overthrow of Dubček. And after the pro-Soviet regime was installed, she was banned from the airwaves. Her recording stock was destroyed. She had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line in a toy factory. And when she walked out on that balcony and began to sing the prayer for Marta, every Czech in the crowd knew every word. That is the moral power of resistance. I'm not naive enough to tell you we're going to succeed. I know the forces arrayed against us. These corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. I don't even know if we'll survive as a species. But in the end, I don't fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. Thank you.
What a great ending. Please ask questions only and try to keep the comments.
We have 3 minutes. Well, unless we stage a revolt, then we have all morning.
Okay, Mr. Hedges, I know you don't believe in atheists, okay, and I've noticed that most of these new atheists never take a Joseph Campbell approach.
Right.
Okay. However, and when it comes to that, you know, I think it's either through ignorance or through omission in the case of Sam Harris. So do you not think that there's a benefit that they provide?
No,
you know?
they're fundamentalists. I debated Sam Harris at UCLA. I debated Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens. That's not an experience I'd wish on you in Berkeley. These people are fundamentalists. Chomsky calls them religious fanatics, i.e. they bow before the state religion. Like the Christian fundamentalists, they create a binary world of us and them. They take our very particular values and promote them as universal values. They want to destroy Muslims, not because they're satanic, but because they're barbaric. Fundamentalism is a mindset. It doesn't have to come through a religious system, although it often does. And they are stunted, deformed, ignorant fundamentalists and racists.
Could you expand your comments on the venality of the Clintons? It appears the Clinton Foundation has hundreds of,
Right.
millions or
Well,
billions
yeah,
of
no,
dollars?
the Clinton Foundation is just one more scam by the Clintons to enrich themselves at our expense and, further their political dynasty. I mean, the fact that Hillary Clinton can run around, espousing the position she espouses when it contradicts everything she's ever done is a kind of window into the vaudevillian nature of American politics. How Clinton can get up and present that he's a, I tell you, one of the reasons I'm in a prison is none of those guys in the prison, everybody in the prison knows not only knows who Bill Clinton is, they know most of them are in there because of Clinton. The prison population in this country under Clinton exploded from about 1.2 million to over 2 million during his presidency. And then he's running around talking about he's a friend of the first African-American president. I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, they are kind of fascinating, but utterly demonic. Yeah.
Well, I'll start with a negative thing, I guess, and go back to the positive. I don't see how you can blame President Clinton for those things, since those are laws that were passed by a Republican Congress, not by Clinton. He did sign it into a law, but he didn't pass the law.
All right, well, Clinton was completely complicit. He and Biden decided that they were going to take the law and order issue away from the Republicans. They rammed through, this was all a Democratic initiative. They massively expanded crimes by which the death penalty would apply. They were the ones who crafted this. They out-Republicaned the Republicans on this issue. On every issue, this was a decision on the part of the Clinton and the Democratic Party to take these issues and this money from the Republicans. No, I think Clinton, or like Woodrow Wilson, I think he will look back and, he did as much or more damage to working men and women in this country as figures like Reagan.
Well, the worst damage in my mind that he did is when he signed the Glass-Steagall Act.
Well, that was one of, yeah.
Out of commission. But
Yeah.
anyway, I wanted to touch on Israel. Many of the Palestinians, the PLO members, were secular. They're not zealots.
Right.
They're dying off, and Israel, as time goes by, is not going to have somebody to negotiate with.
Right.
All the
No,
young people
Israel-
that are coming up, and all the new leaders from Hezbollah or the other group
Right.
are zealots. So shouldn't they try to come up with a peace?
Yeah, that would be a rational thing for
initiative?
Israel to do. Unfortunately, Israel's run by Bibi Netanyahu. Look, Israel's great failure, I'm going to cut it off after this. Israel's great failure
I have a quick question.
is that it, as we in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't grasp, when you brutalize people, they become brutal. You do saturation bombing of Cambodia, you get Pol Pot. You do saturation bombing of Syria and Iraq, you're going to end up with ISIS. Israel's foreign policy, which is a war crime, especially the bombing of Gaza. This is the bombing of people who have no army, no navy, no air force, no command and control, no heavy weapons. That's not a war, that's called murder, including 500 children, is very similar to the kind of death spiral that we're on throughout the Middle East. Very misguided. One last question, then I'll answer very quick.
I just wanted to know, there's so many things wrong, and you say that we should resist. What do you think are the most crucial places where we can resist?
I think that there are a series of movements that have risen up in the wake of the Occupy movement, which I was very involved in. Black Lives Matter, the anti-fracking movement, the anti-capitalist movement, the drive to raise the minimum wage. These are all important movements that are grassroots movement that are not allied with a particular political system, that are fighting on behalf of the environment, fighting on behalf of working men and women. And I think all of our energy, I've been very involved in the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement against Israel, where college by college, church by church, institution by institution, we are trying to do what we did to the apartheid regime in South Africa. And I think all of our energy should go into those movements. The goal is to create movements, as Karl Popper said. It's not how do you get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. As Popper said, most people attracted to power are at best mediocre or venal. The question is, how do you make the power elite frightened of you? So the last liberal president we had was Richard Nixon, not because he was a liberal or had a heart or a conscience, but because he was frightened of movements. So we had, in '71, in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, where the White House is surrounded, end to end, empty city buses. There's a gigantic anti-war demonstration, and Kissinger is looking out the window with Kissinger wringing his hands, going, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's where people in power should be. Thank you.
The author will be signing, you're going to be doing a book signing downstairs at the bottom of the escalator if you go left, and you can continue your